The story begins with the Franks, a Germanic tribe that rose from the shadows of the fallen Roman world. From the 5th through the 10th century, they ruled vast lands once known as Gaul, territories stretching across modern France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. Out of this legacy emerged a dynasty that would dominate the stage of medieval Europe, the Carolingians. The Carolingian Empire, reigning from 800 to 888 CE, was no ordinary realm. Built upon faith, war, and ambition, it shaped the course of Western Europe during the early Middle Ages. The dynasty stood as the second and most powerful of the great monastic rulers of the Franks. For nearly 2 centuries, their empire was a beacon of authority, culture, and conquest, a force that would one day give birth to France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire itself. The rise began with Pepin the Short, crowned king of the Franks in the mid-8th century. His ascension followed a decisive moment in history, the Battle of Tours in 732. In that clash, Frankish and Burgundian forces stopped the Muslim advance into Europe. The victory secured the Carolingian family's claim to power and opened the way for a dynasty that would dominate the continent. From 750 onward, their power expanded. The coronation of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, by Pope Leo III in the year 800 marked the true birth of the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne's reign, lasting until 814, transformed the Franks into one of the most formidable empires since Rome itself. His armies conquered Italy, united vast swaths of Western and Central Europe, and revived the dream of imperial unity. Known as Charles I in France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire, his influence echoed far beyond his lifetime. Yet, behind the glory, shadows gathered. The Carolingian world was never as unshakable as it seemed. After Charlemagne's death, the empire faced bitter succession disputes, external invasions, and internal fragmentation. The dream of unity began to fracture, piece by piece. The end came with Charles the Fat, 839 to 888, whose reign saw the final unraveling. His inability to hold the empire together, combined with relentless attacks from Vikings and the restless ambitions of rival lords, brought the dynasty crashing down. With his death, the once mighty Carolingian Empire dissolved into fragments, leaving behind only the ghost of an empire that had once sought to rule all of Western Europe. This is the story of the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, a tale of power, ambition, and the haunting reminder that even the greatest empires are not eternal. Charlemagne's reign was one of grandeur, ambition, and relentless transformation. Born in 742, he ruled as both king and emperor, his influence stretching across nearly as much territory as the Western Roman Empire had once commanded. Yet behind the triumphs, his rule was marked by a constant struggle to hold together a fragile unity. One of Charlemagne's most enduring legacies was the spread of Christianity. Sometimes it arrived peacefully, through the flowering of culture and faith known as the Carolingian Renaissance. At other times it came through fire and steel. The Saxons to the east resisted conversion, clinging to their Germanic pagan traditions. Charlemagne's wars against them were merciless. The old gods were outlawed and defiance was punished with death. The empire expanded, but at a terrible cost. Charlemagne also sought to bind his diverse subjects together not only by faith, but through culture, education, and language. His court became the center of a remarkable intellectual revival. Ancient manuscripts were copied and preserved. A new script, the Carolingian minuscule, was crafted, clear, elegant, and legible, laying the foundation for future European writing. Schools were established, scholars gathered, and even the fractured Latin tongue was standardized. For a time, it seemed as though a new golden age was dawning. And yet, shadows crept ever closer. Charlemagne divided his empire among his sons, Pepin, Charles the Younger, and Louis the Pious. But fate was cruel. 2 of his heirs died early, leaving only Louis to inherit the crown after Charlemagne's death in 814. What seemed like a smooth transition would instead ignite one of the bloodiest family feuds of the Middle Ages. Louis the Pious, though devoted to the ideals of his father, proved less capable of holding the empire together. His reign was plagued by civil war, betrayal, and the relentless practice of gavelkind, the division of lands among heirs. Unlike the later system of primogeniture, which preserved dynasties through a single heir, gavelkind shattered kingdoms into pieces with every generation. By the year 817, Louis had already parceled out his empire among his 3 sons. But when he attempted to include Charles the Bald, a younger son from his second marriage, the fragile balance collapsed. Brothers turned on one another, and the empire descended into chaos. From 823 to 835, the Carolingian Civil War raged. Sons rebelled against their father, and Louis the Pious was humiliated, dethroned, imprisoned and restored, again and again. His eldest, Lothar, sought to dominate, only to be cast out and then reinstated. Pepin and Louis the German plotted their own rise, while Charles the Bald became both pawn and prize in this dynastic struggle. It was a cycle of betrayal and bloodshed that foreshadowed the inevitable fate of the empire. By the time peace was restored in 835, the once united Carolingian realm was already crumbling from within. The foundation laid by Charlemagne was breaking apart, and the collapse of the Carolingian Empire had truly begun. When Louis the Pious died in 840, the fragile unity of Charlemagne's empire shattered. His eldest son Lothar I claimed the Frankish Empire in its entirety, declaring himself sole ruler. But his brothers Charles the Bald and Louis the German rose against him. Civil war once again engulfed the empire. Lothar's armies faltered, and by 842, his brothers sealed an alliance known as the Oaths of Strasbourg. This pact not only ended Lothar's ambitions of sole rule but also planted the seeds of division. For the first time, the lands that would one day become France and Germany began to take shape. The following year, in 843, the bitter struggle reached its resolution in the Treaty of Verdun. Charlemagne's once mighty empire was torn into three kingdoms: West Francia ruled by Charles the Bald, East Francia given to Louis the German, and the fragile Middle Kingdom retained by Lothar. Though the treaty ended the war, it ensured the empire's dismemberment. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire had begun in earnest. The consequences of the Treaty of Verdun would echo for more than 1,000 years. The division of Charlemagne's lands ignored cultural and geographic realities, sowing hostility that would resurface time and again, echoing all the way to the modern conflicts of the 20th century. Lothar's Middle Kingdom, stretching from the Low Countries through Burgundy into Italy, was hopelessly fractured by mountains and rival interests. It dissolved into petty states, leaving the Italian peninsula fragmented until its unification in the 1800s. Meanwhile, West Francia evolved into France and East Francia grew into Germany, though even their unity would not come until centuries later. The Carolingian dynasty's decline was accelerated not only by family rivalries, but also by external enemies and internal weakness. The Hungarians and Muslims raided from afar. But within, the nobility grew restless. Empowered by tax collection and labor extraction, they demanded ever more land. As conquests ceased, monarchs could no longer satisfy them. The frustrated nobles seized churches and monasteries, turning holy sites into weapons of political power. The monarchy weakened while aristocrats grew stronger, dismantling the centralized authority Charlemagne had so carefully built. The empire's last flicker of unity came under Charles the Fat. Crowned emperor in 881, he briefly reunited much of Charlemagne's vast realm. But when the Vikings threatened Paris in 886, Charles failed to defend his people. Instead, he paid them to leave, a decision that horrified his court and revealed the hollowness of Carolingian power. Betrayed by his own nobles, abandoned by his armies, Charles fled. When he died in 888, the illusion of empire died with him. The Carolingian dynasty collapsed, its power shattered, its lands divided. What had once been the greatest empire of the early Middle Ages dissolved into fragments, kingdoms, duchies, and principalities that would chart the course of European history for centuries to come. This was the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, a story of ambition, glory, and inevitable decline. If you enjoyed this journey into the fall of one of history's greatest dynasties, make sure to subscribe to History Love, your go-to channel for exploring the fascinating stories of the past. Join us as we uncover the mysteries, triumphs, and downfalls that shaped our world.